For over 300 years, the Philippines was a Spanish colony. But this wasn't just a simple story of conquest. It was a story of choices, really tough choices. Do you fight? Do you comply? Or do you just run? Today, we're going to explore the three paths that really shaped a nation.
I mean, really think about it for a second. What would you do? Some foreign power shows up on your shores. They've got a new flag, a new god, a whole new set of laws. Everything you've ever known is suddenly turned completely upside down. How do you even begin to respond to that?
When you look at the history, the responses really came down to these three fundamental choices, and each one had its own logic and its own brutal consequences. You could take up arms and fight back, obviously. You could comply, try to adapt and find a way to survive inside this new system. Or you could flee, escaping to preserve your own way of life far away from all that colonial control. So let's dig into each of these paths.
Okay, let's start with the most dramatic one, the path of resistance. And we're not talking about just a little flicker of rebellion here and there. This was a fire that burned for centuries, all across the islands.
200. Just let that number sink in. That's roughly how many major uprisings historians have counted during the Spanish era. 200. That number alone tells you an incredible story of a people who just never, ever stopped fighting for their freedom.
And yeah, while there were hundreds of these individual revolts, two massive long-term conflicts really came to define this entire era of resistance, and each one was fought for fundamentally different but equally powerful reasons.
And this slide just lays it out perfectly. Down south, you had the Moro Wars. This was all about defending faith and sovereignty. The Muslim sultanates in Mindanao didn't just see the Spanish as invaders. They saw them as a direct threat to Islam itself, and that sparked a holy war, a jihad. But then, up in the Tagalog region, the fight was over something else entirely: land. These huge agrarian uprisings exploded because religious friars were gobbling up massive estates, kicking local people off the very lands their ancestors had farmed for generations. You could almost call it a war for the soul versus a war for the soil.
So what actually pushed someone to make that choice, to risk everything and fight back? Well, the reasons were as diverse as the islands themselves. It could be anything from a personal insult to just crushing systemic oppression.
This table breaks it down really well. Sometimes the spark was deeply personal. A local chief, Lacandula, revolts because his family's tax exemption gets taken away. Other times, it was political. People like Diego and Gabriela Silang fighting back against corrupt and abusive officials. It could be economic, right? Like Francisco Maniago leading a revolt because farmers weren't getting paid for their crops. And sometimes, it was about faith.
And the story of Hermano Pule is such a powerful and tragic example of this. So as a native Filipino, he wasn't allowed to become a Catholic priest. But he was deeply devout, so he started his own religious brotherhood, and it became hugely popular. Well, the Spanish authorities got scared. They couldn't control this native-led movement, so they declared it illegal and started hunting him and his followers down. This basically forced Pule to go from being a spiritual leader to a rebel commander, literally fighting for the right to worship. He was eventually captured and executed on November 4th, 1841, which of course just turned him into a powerful martyr for the cause. But look, not everyone chose to fight. That wasn't always an option. For many, many people, the only path forward, the path to survival, was one of compliance and adaptation.
Religion. This was the Spaniards' key tool for control. And they were really strategic about it. They didn't just show up and force Catholicism on people. They presented it in ways that felt, familiar. The promise of salvation was a huge draw, for sure. But so were the little things, the parallels to native beliefs. Grand festivals and processions looked a lot like local rituals. Saints could be understood as new, powerful spirits, kind of like the native anitos, and using holy water for cleansing, that resonated with traditional beliefs about water's purifying power. It was this clever blending that made conversion feel less like a total rejection of the old ways. The Spanish also rolled out this brilliant and frankly brutal system of physical control called reduction. Step 1. Force people to leave their scattered ancestral villages and resettle them into these centralized towns. Step 2. With everyone packed into one place, it's way easier to monitor and control them. And Step 3. Exploit them. This made it super efficient to collect taxes and enforce forced labor. It was a machine built for oppression. And this policy completely reshaped Filipino society, cutting communities off from their lands and creating the town-centric layout that still exists in many places today.
We also have to talk about the really difficult truth of collaboration. It happened. Some Filipinos, often from the existing elite class, chose to side with the Spanish. Why? To protect their own wealth, their own status. They became a part of the colonial machine. It's a complicated, messy choice, often made in the name of survival and self-interest.
And that brings us to that third path, to flee. Now, the Spanish had a name for these people. They called them tulisanes, bandits. But you have to understand, a name can be a weapon. From the Filipino point of view, these weren't criminals. They were refugees in their own homeland. They were escaping crushing taxes and forced labor to live freely up in the mountains, trying to preserve their culture far from the sound of the church bells. It wasn't banditry. It was an act of profound self-preservation.
So after all that, after centuries of struggle, what was the outcome? The Spanish were in charge for over 300 years, but here's the kicker. They never, ever truly conquered the entire Philippines. All that constant resistance we talked about, it had a real lasting result. And you can see it right here. Two huge regions held out successfully against the Spanish for centuries. You had Mindanao in the south, fiercely defended by its powerful Muslim sultanates, and the rugged, inaccessible Cordillera Mountains in the north. And this is the incredible legacy of that resistance. Because these areas were never fully subdued, they basically became sanctuaries. In these places, indigenous cultures, the Islamic faith, and pre-colonial values could survive, even thrive, protected from the full force of colonization. They represent a living, unbroken link to the Philippines' past, and they continue to shape its incredible diversity today.
So we'll end on this thought. The story of the Philippines isn't just one of colonization. It's a story of constant resistance, of complex adaptation, and of enduring unconquered independence. When we make sure to remember the unconquered right alongside the colonized, we get a much richer, more complex, and I think a much more truthful picture of how this nation was truly forged in fire.